all other world religions have some kind of an undergirding, right? Something behind it that says this is what kind of defines what we believe. And people will look at those sacred texts and say, well, why should I believe that the Bible is different from those? And the answer is that the Bible is different. And that's what I'm going to cover in this video. So we're going to look at the fact that the Bible really is truly unique among all other sacred texts. Now, I'm only going to be able to compare it to just three for the sake of time here, but we'll see that between these three texts and the Bible, there are significant differences. So we're going to look at the Book of Mormon, which is the sacred text or the foundational text for the Mormon religion. We're going to look at the Quran, which is the foundational text for the Muslim religion, and the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of the sacred text and really the core sacred text of the Hindu faith. So we're going to start by looking at the fact that there's a unique history to the Bible that's different from the kind of pattern of history that we see in these three. So let's take a look at the Book of Mormon and its history. It claims to detail events that occurred between the years of 600 BC and 385 AD among a people who, according to the Book of Mormon, came from the Middle East, from kind of the Israel area, and came across the sea and into North America. And that really the native peoples of North America, the American Indians, as we sometimes call them, are actually the descendants of these Middle Eastern people. Now, you can decide whether or not you think that there's any credibility to that kind of a story, but here's what we see about this book. While it says it details events from 600 BC to 385 AD, it was written down on these golden plates and then buried and then uncovered in the 1800s by a man named Joseph Smith, who published it in 1830, really as the only person who claims to have ever truly seen these golden plates. And so therefore, its history is suspect, right? There are some things that would cause us to doubt whether or not the history of this book has any credibility to it. Now let's look at the Quran. It was, according to the story, given to Muhammad in 610 AD by an angel who revealed its truths to him and told him what to write and basically dictated it to him while he sat in a cave and wrote down all of the words that were given to him. But after he wrote all these things down, he only shared them with a small group of companions who each took a few pages and wrapped them around swords and then took care of those swords in sheaths. And it was sort of there's a whole story to it. And there were a lot of wars and fightings. And after Muhammad's death, there was a lot of conflict over which pages were legitimate and which ones weren't. And finally, it wasn't until 685, long after Muhammad was dead, that they actually published the first version. I shouldn't even say published. That's the year that we can point to where the oldest living copy that we have of the Quran exists. And so once again, there's a large gap in time between when it was given and when the first complete version appears in history. And that leaves us with some suspicion about, well, what's the legitimacy of this text? When we look at the Bhagavad Gita, it claims to detail a conversation that took place in 5000 BC, but its earliest writing isn't until 500 BC. And it goes through many different forms all the way up until about 400 AD, where the current form that we have of the Bhagavad Gita dates to about 400 AD. Now let's compare that to the history of the Bible, and we can look at just a few things in the timeline here. For example, the fact that in 1400 BC, Moses receives the Torah and immediately shares it with all of the Israelite people. And historically speaking, we have lots of reason, especially from archaeology, to see that what is said in the Torah immediately influences these people. Very soon after the date of the giving of the Torah, we actually start to see things in archaeology that are influenced by it. For example, in Israel, we see specific structures to homes that seem to be guided by things that are in the Old Testament law. And so it's clear that from the moment these things were handed to Moses, they were put into practice. Now it's 500 BC when Ezra compiles all the Old Testament writings, which have been written by the prophets and psalmists and part of the living history of the Israelites for the last 1,000 years. And he compiles all of that into a text that has clearly guided them as a people for centuries. We get into the New Testament and we see that one of the earliest writings of the New Testament is the book of James, written probably about 47 AD, based on some good research on that, which means that James is writing this within 15 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, not very long after. And many of the people who he's writing to would have been alive when those things happened. And then Mark writes his first gospel at the latest 55 AD, based on some good research on kind of when things were written. So it could have been even earlier than that. John writes the last book of the New Testament in 95 AD, Revelation, and then we see the first Christian authors after the New Testament era, Justin Martyr and Clement. Both are using the the New Testament rather. They're quoting the New Testament regularly in the things that they're writing. And so we know that those texts already exist very close in time to the time that the Christians are using them, and that those texts are detailing things that happened very close in time to when they're written. So that's a unique history of the Bible. And then we also have to consider the unique language of the Bible. So, for example, the Book of Mormon, it claims to be written originally in the golden plates in modern Egyptian, which is a made-up language as far as we can tell. There's really no archaeological record of any kind of anything called modern Egyptian. And from the few things we have from Joseph Smith's letters where he has written it out, it looks like it's borrowed letters from Greek and Hebrew, but there's nothing to hold on to there. But the book itself, when published, was translated into English by Joseph Smith and published in English, and there's no version of it available in anything other than English. Now, the Quran, on the other hand, is written in Arabic, and according to the Muslim faith, actually, if it's translated into English, it's not the Quran anymore. According to them, only the words in the Arabic are actually the Quran, and any English translation is untrustworthy. And so to read it, you actually have to learn Arabic and read it in Arabic. And then you have the Bhagavad Gita, which was written in Sanskrit, entirely in Sanskrit. And once again, it's something where most people will say you can read a translation of it, but it's best if you read it in its original language. The Bible is different in this, that it's written originally in 3 different languages. Hebrew, there's sections that are written in Aramaic, and then in Greek. And why this is important is because what's clear to us is that it's written in the language of the times for the people who are reading it. And so it's not sort of designed just for one people group who speak one particular language. Rather, it's intended to be spread across. And these were largely spread out languages. Hebrew was used not just by the Israelites, but by other Hebrew peoples who were non-Israelite Hebrews. And then Aramaic was the language of the time when Babylon was the empire. And then Greek was even more widespread. And so the Bible was clearly designed to be read by many people. Now, since then, of course, the Bible's been translated into thousands of different languages. And so it's clear that the history of the Bible is one where we're trying to get it into the hands of anyone and everyone so that it's accessible to all people. And we could talk about the content of the Bible versus the content of these books. And let's look a little bit at the different content that we see in these other 3 sacred texts that we're looking at. For example, there's the Book of Mormon, which is a history that, according to the Mormons, it's a history that reveals the ordinances of the gospel, which is kind of a weird statement anyway. The word gospel means good news, but according to the Mormons, the gospel means the rules that you have to follow in order to be right with God. So they are the things you must do to be saved. That's the main content. And as I said before, it's a history of a people group that may not have actually existed. The Quran, on the other hand, is just a philosophical text. It doesn't really detail much history, although it has some stories of things that happened in it. It's mostly statements about who God is and who mankind is and our relationship with God. And it basically says this is mankind's duty toward God. And then the Bhagavad Gita details a conversation about the principles that govern the universe and what mankind must do to find enlightenment. If you see a general theme with these things, each of these books in their content are driven at telling us what we as mankind have to do to be saved. There's a difference then when we look at the Bible, a unique book that tells the history of God's interaction with the world from start to finish. None of the other sacred texts claim to have that widespread look at everything from start to finish. And it's really the story of how God set about to save mankind by the sacrifice of Jesus. But it's not a story like it's a made-up story. It's presented as a real, true history of the events of the world through God's eyes, as well as the events of the Israelite people leading up to the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the result of that series of events. And then God turns around and makes a promise to us in that book as to what he's going to do for mankind in the future now that he has sent that Savior from sin. And so that leads us to think about a unique message to the Bible. See, each of these other books that we're looking at has kind of a similar message. The Book of Mormon, do this and you will have eternal progression. The Quran, do this and God will look favorably on you. The Bhagavad Gita, do this and you will achieve enlightenment. But the Bible has a different message. Here is what God has done to save you. In other words, where other sacred texts present a message of do, the Bible presents a message of done. Not by us, but by God. Where the other sacred texts present a message of rules, regulations, and paths to follow, the Bible presents a message of a person who has saved you and calls you to follow him. And so it really is unique. And that leads us to the kind of the final point, that the Bible has a unique power here. When I think about the Book of Mormon, as I look at all of the facts surrounding it, I conclude that it's really just a story invented by a man, and it has no power to save you. There's nothing in it that can say this is what can change and transform your entire life. The Quran is also just a bunch of ideas devised by a man, or some would claim maybe by a demon. It's possible that Muhammad met a demon in the cave and that demon deceived him. I don't know. But the point is, it has no power to save because there's no salvation in it. It's only what you must do to be right with God. The Bhagavad Gita is a philosophy clearly shaped over centuries by people thinking about things. It has no power to save you. But the Bible itself says, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. And those who have spent their lives in the Bible have seen the transforming power that it has. But we could even point back to events the Bible itself describes and the transformational power that it provides there, as Jesus' first followers heard the message from Jesus himself. They saw the power that he had. They saw his death. They saw his resurrection, and they carried that message out, and it literally changed the world. I mean, think about that for a moment, that before Christianity, there were no Christians. And then this young rabbi shows up in the Middle East. He preaches for 3 years. He's killed as a martyr. Many people were killed as martyrs. Many would-be messiahs who rose up and said, I am the promised one, who died and we've forgotten their names. Many who have tried to lead a religious revolution. But Jesus stood up and preached a message of forgiveness, love from God, peace with God. They put him to death for it. He rose from death. He showed himself. And now a third of the world follows him. He has changed the face of every country across the globe in some way. And his followers have done amazing things to show the love of God to people in their lives. Western society is built on the principles that come from this one movement, this one man, this one book. The Bible is truly unique. So when we compare the Bible with other spiritual texts, other scriptures, things that people might want to trust in, we see that the Bible stands apart. Now, does that make the Bible true? Not necessarily. But does it give us a reason as Christians to have confidence that this is the Word of God and something that we can rely on? I think so. And that's a reason why we use the Bible as the basis for our doctrine, for our teaching, for our truth, because it really is a unique book.